74 degrees in late October, and the air smelled like dried spit and bankruptcy. Dust tasted like pulverized copper when the wind kicked up over the auction block. Hendricks stood near the back of the crowd, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded Carhartt jacket, feeling the familiar grinding ache in his right knee. This was the third foreclosure auction in Mercer County this month. It never got easier watching a man's life get sold off in numbered lots. 14 tractors sat in a jagged row at the edge of the dying soybean field. They weren't machines anymore. They were corpses. Bleached paint flat tires sinking into the dry crust of the earth, hydraulic lines hanging loose like severed arteries, weeping thick black fluid. Some were ancient Fords, their blue paint oxidized to a chalky gray. A few were massive mid-90s, Case 1H, articulated beasts, their massive hinge pins rusted solid. None of them had run in a decade. They were the bone pile. The auctioneer, a fast-talking kid from 2 counties over, rattled through the bids with the enthusiasm of a coroner reading a toe tag. Hendricks watched the local corporate buyers, the Stanton brothers, mostly picking off the good land and the newer computerized combines. They didn't even look at the bone pile. Scrap prices were down. It would cost more in diesel to haul those dead hulks to the crusher than the steel was worth. Then she raised her card. She stood a few feet to Hendricks's left. Late 50s, maybe older. Sun-damaged skin pulled tight over high cheekbones. Graying hair shoved unceremoniously under a stained feed cap. She wore a heavy denim jacket that looked like it had been dragged behind a truck. "Lot 42, the auctioneer droned, pointing a pen at a seized-up John Deere 4440. "Opening at 500, the woman flicked her card. Hendricks frowned, chewing the inside of his cheek. The Stanton brothers chuckled from the front row. One of them spat sunflower seeds into the dirt. 500 to the lady in the back. Do I hear 6? Silence. Just the wind rattling the dry husks of the beans. Sold, 500. The auctioneer moved down the line. A Massey Ferguson with a cracked engine block. She bid. A rusted-out International Harvester, missing its entire rear axle. She bid. She didn't hesitate. She didn't check a notebook. She just kept flicking that white card, her face a flat, unreadable mask. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long, bruised shadows across the field, she had bought all 14 of them. 14 dead, rotting mechanical carcasses. Hendricks couldn't help himself. He was old, he was tired, and he hated watching people drown. He shuffled over as the crowd dispersed, his boots crunching loud on the dry gravel. "You're buying scrap, lady," he said. His voice was gravelly, ruined by 40 years of unfiltered camels and diesel exhaust. She didn't look up immediately. She was securing a heavy leather binder, her hands thick-knuckled and stained with old grease. When she finally turned to him, her eyes were a washed-out pale blue. They looked like winter ice over a cattle pond. "Scrap is a state of mind," she said. Her voice wasn't defensive. It was hollow, exhausted. "No." Hendricks pointed a thick, calloused finger at the nearest Case YH. "Scrap is a cracked manifold. Scrap is a seized piston welded to the cylinder wall by 10 years of rainwater. You got a fleet of paperweights." She finally looked at the tractors. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor moved through her jaw. "I got parts. You got a hauling bill that's going to bankrupt you before you even get a wrench on them." Hendricks didn't know why he cared. Maybe it was the way she stood shoulders squared against a world that was clearly beating her down. He recognized the posture. He saw it in the mirror every morning. "I've got a flatbed," she said, turning away from him. And a winch. I'll get 'em moved." "Where to?" She pointed a dirt-smudged finger toward the horizon, right at the old Henderson place. A dilapidated property that bordered Hendrix's own failing 300 acres. The barn roof was caved in on one side. "Henderson sold that place 2 years ago," Hendrix said. "I know, I bought it." She shoved the binder under her arm. "Name's Joanne." She didn't offer her hand. Hendrix didn't offer his. He just stood there smelling the lingering ozone of the coming winter, watching her walk toward a rusted square-body Chevy dually. "You're making a mistake, Joanne," he muttered to the wind. She didn't look back. Over the next 3 days, Hendrix listened to the agonizing metal-on-metal screech of dead iron being dragged across asphalt. She was moving them one by one. 14 trips. It sounded like something dying over and over again. Rain came in November. Cold, spiteful rain that turned the Mercer County topsoil into heavy gray grease. Hendrix sat on his porch, a lukewarm mug of black coffee, resting on his knee, watching the floodlights cut through the downpour over at the Henderson place. It was 2 in the morning. The lights had been burning every night for 3 weeks. He told himself to stay out of it. He told himself she was a stubborn fool wasting her pension or whatever money she had on a graveyard. But the rhythmic, metallic clack, clack, clack of an impact wrench echoed across the dark fields drifting over the property line like a persistent mosquito. He set his coffee down. The mug chipped against the wooden railing. He grabbed his slicker, a heavy rubber coat that smelled faintly of mildew, and walked to his truck. The mud road to her barn was deeply rutted, the tire tracks filled with standing water that reflected his headlights in fractured bursts. When he pulled up, the scene was worse than he imagined. The barn was a slaughterhouse of iron. Tractors were in various stages of brutal dismemberment. Massive tires taller than a man leaned against the rotting wood walls. Engine blocks hung suspended from a creaking gantry crane, dripping heavy black oil into stained plastic kiddie pools. Joanne was under the gutted belly of a Ford 8000. Hendrix stood in the doorway. The air inside was thick with the sharp chemical burn of PB blaster stale sweat and the acrid smoke of a cheap wire feed welder. "You're gonna crush yourself," Hendrix said, raising his voice over the hammering rain on the tin roof. Joanne slid out from under the chassis on a piece of greasy cardboard. She looked terrible. Her face was smeared with soot and oil. A jagged cut across her cheekbone was sealed with a piece of dirty electrical tape. She sat up, wiping her hands on a rag that was already saturated with fluid. "Didn't hear you pull up," she rasped. She coughed a deep rattling sound in her chest. "Hard to hear anything over you stripping bolts at 2 in the morning." Hendrix stepped inside, water pooling around his boots. He looked at the chaos. It wasn't random, he realized. She was categorizing. Injectors in one crate, good fuel pumps in another. She wasn't trying to fix the 14 tractors. She was cannibalizing them. "I need the transmission out of this Ford," she said, ignoring his judgment. She gestured to the iron beast above her. "The bell housing matches the bolt pattern on the deer block over there. If I drill out the top 2 holes..." Hendrix stared at her. "You're trying to mate a Ford transmission to a John Deere block. Are you out of your mind? The input shafts don't match. The gearing is completely wrong." "I took the clutch plate from the case," she said flatly. "Splines line up, barely, but they line up." Hendrix walked over to the transmission. He crouched down, his bad knee popping loud enough to echo in the damp air. He shone his flashlight onto the mounting bolts. They were rusted solid, fused together by decades of heat cycles and neglect. The head of one bolt was completely rounded off. "You'll never break that loose," Hendricks said softly. "It's fused. You need an acetylene torch." "I don't have a torch." She stood up, swaying slightly, and picked up a 3-foot length of steel pipe. She slipped it over the handle of her socket wrench to make a breaker bar. "I have leverage." She slid back under the tractor. Hendricks watched her position the socket. He watched her muscles strain her boots, slipping in the mud and oil pooling on the floor. She grunted a low, guttural sound of pure exertion. The pipe bowed. Snap. The socket slipped. Joanne's elbow slammed violently against the cast-iron frame of the tractor. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just lay there on the cardboard, her chest heaving, holding her arm against her ribs. The only sound was the rain hammering the roof and the slow drip-drip of oil hitting a metal pan. Hendricks felt a tight knot form in his throat. It was the absolute lack of self-pity that broke him. He knew that silence. He knew what it felt like to have the farm, the bank, the sky, and the iron all fighting against you, and knowing that complaining wouldn't loosen a single bolt. He turned around and walked out to his truck. He didn't say a word. He dug behind the seat, pushing aside a tangled mess of jumper cables and empty oil quarts until he found his heavy canvas tool bag. He grabbed his portable oxygen acetylene rig from the truck bed. When he walked back into the barn, Joanne was sitting up wrapping a greasy shop towel around her bleeding elbow. She watched him drag the heavy tanks across the dirt floor. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice tight. "Shut up and hand me a striker," Hendricks growled. He sparked the torch. The bright, blinding blue flame hissed, cutting through the shadows of the barn. He adjusted the oxygen, making the flame tight and aggressive. He slid under the Ford, the heat of the torch instantly warming his damp face. He focused the flame directly onto the rounded bolt. He watched the rusted metal turn from dull gray to a dull red, then to a bright, angry cherry. The smell of burning grease and vaporizing rust filled his nose. It smelled like work. It smelled like the 40 years he had spent keeping his own dying machinery alive. "Hand me the breaker bar," Hendricks muttered, keeping the flame steady. Joanne slid the wrench and the steel pipe over to him. Hendricks killed the torch. While the metal was still glowing hot, expanding and breaking the rust weld, he slipped the socket on and pulled down. With a loud metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot, the bolt broke free. It squealed in protest as he backed it out, dropping the hot, useless chunk of steel onto the dirt. Hendricks slid out from under the machine. He shut off the gas valves on his tanks. He didn't look at her. "You need to heat the bottom too as well," he said, wiping his hands on his pants, "or you'll crack the housing." He walked back to his truck and drove home. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. His hands smelled like burned iron, and for the first time in 3 years since his wife died, his house felt suffocatingly quiet. January hit Mercer County like a swinging anvil. The mud froze into jagged concrete. The wind stripped the branches bare and howled through the gaps in Hendricks's window frames. The Stanton brothers had made their move. Irritated by the junkyard lowering their property values, they called the county zoning board. An assessor had driven out to the Henderson place 2 weeks ago. Hendricks had watched from his fence line. He saw the assessor waving a clipboard. He saw Joanne stand there stiff as a board, holding a wrench. She didn't yell. She just turned her back and walked into the barn. The fine was $10,000. Hendricks heard about it at the diner in town. Unpermitted salvage operation. Environmental hazard due to fluid leakage. She had 30 days to clear the lot, or the county would seize the property and scrap the iron themselves. They were trying to kill her off. It was the corporate way. Starve the small operator out, take the land for pennies. Hendricks drove over that afternoon. The cold was bitter, freezing the moisture in his nostrils the second he stepped out of his truck. The barn doors were pulled shut, but the glow of the halogen lights leaked through the warped wood. He pushed the heavy door open. The cannibalization was complete. In the center of the dirt floor sat a monster. It was hideous. The heavy square frame of a Case IH, the massive dark green engine block of a John Deere, the blue rusted rear axle and transmission of a Ford. It was bolted together with heavy steel plate Joanne must have fabricated herself. Wires hung everywhere like a rat's nest. A plastic boat gas tank was temporarily strapped to the side of the engine with heavy-duty ratchet straps. Joanne was standing on the front tire, leaning over the massive engine, a heavy coat bundled around her. She was bleeding again, a fresh scrape across her knuckles. "It's a Frankenstein," Hendricks said, his breath pluming white in the freezing air. "It's a tractor," she replied, not looking up. She was tightening down the high-pressure fuel lines to the injectors. "County gave you 30 days. I don't care what the county gave me." She tightened the last nut and climbed down. She looked thinner. Her eyes were hollowed out dark circles, bruising the skin beneath them. "Stanton's own the assessor. They own the feed store. They own the local fuel delivery. Refused to sell me off-road diesel." "How are you running it then?" She kicked a red 5-gallon jug near the tire. "Bought kerosene from the hardware store. Mixed it with a little transmission fluid for lubrication. It'll burn." Hendricks shook his head. "Joanne, even if this abomination starts, and that's a massive if, what are you going to do? You have no land to farm. You have no implements." She stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind rattling the tin roof. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes. She offered him one. He took it. She lit his, then hers. "My husband," she said, exhaling a thin stream of gray smoke into the freezing air. "He was a mechanic, the best I ever saw. He could listen to an engine running a mile away and tell you if the timing was off by a degree." Hendricks smoked in silence, waiting. "We had a good shop down in Texas, specialized in heavy ag equipment. Then the big dealerships moved in, started putting proprietary software in everything, making it illegal to fix your own machines. Farmers couldn't afford us, and we couldn't get the codes to bypass the computers. We went bankrupt." She looked at the glowing cherry of her cigarette. He couldn't take it. The failure. He walked into the shop one night, started up a combine we were working on, closed the bay doors, and sat there until the carbon monoxide took him. Hendricks felt a cold weight settle in his gut. It was heavier than the winter air. "I bought these," she gestured to the mechanical beast in front of them, "because they don't have computers, because they are just steel and fuel and fire. The Stantons think I'm building a farm. I'm not. I'm building a fleet. A fleet. There are hundreds of farmers within a 200-mile radius going broke because they can't afford a software update on a $500,000 tractor. I'm going to lease them mechanical tractors. No screens, no codes, just pure unkillable iron." She tossed her cigarette into a puddle of slush. "But first," she said, walking toward the cab, "this one has to start." Hendricks watched her climb into the seat. It was a metal pan seat, ripped from an old Ford bolted loosely to the floorboard. There was no key, just a toggle switch and a heavy push button she had wired directly to the starter. "Cold start on a modified block with kerosene," Hendricks muttered to himself. "You're gonna need ether." He walked over, pulled a can of starting fluid from his coat pocket. He never left home without it in the winter, and sprayed a heavy dose directly into the open-air intake manifold. "Hit it!" he yelled. Joanne flipped the toggle switch. She pressed the button. The starter engaged. Whirr! It sounded agonizingly slow. The thick, cold oil fought the rotation of the massive crank. The battery, a massive commercial unit she had salvaged, strained. Whirr! Hendricks sprayed another shot of ether. "Keep your foot off the throttle. Let it catch. Whirr! Pop!" A violent backfire echoed through the barn, echoing like a cannon shot. White smoke puffed from the exhaust pipe, a straight rusted pipe pointing toward the ceiling. "Again!" Hendricks shouted. She pressed the button. Whirr! Suddenly the engine caught. It didn't purr. It violently detonated. The ether ignited, forcing the heavy pistons down. The engine surged a deafening, terrifying roar of unmuffled diesel combustion. Black soot violently erupted from the exhaust pipe, showering the barn roof. The entire frame shook violently. The mismatched metal vibrated, screaming against itself. It sounded like an earthquake tearing through a scrapyard. But it was running. The idle was horribly rough, hunting up and down the RPM range, the mechanical governor fighting to find a rhythm. Smoke filled the barn, thick, choking and smelling of burnt kerosene and vaporized oil. Joanne sat in the seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't smiling. She was staring straight ahead through the soot and the smoke, her chest rising and falling. Hendricks stepped back, waving the smoke away from his face. His ears were ringing painfully. The noise was absolute, a physical force pressing against his chest. He looked at the machine. It was leaking oil from the oil pan gasket. The radiator hoses were vibrating violently. It was a terrifying, ugly, crude monstrosity, and it was beautiful. Joanne reached down and grabbed a heavy lever beside the seat. She depressed the stiff clutch pedal. She forced the lever into gear. The transmission let out a horrifying grind, the Ford gears protesting the brutal torque of the John Deere engine, and then with a heavy thud, it engaged. She slowly let off the clutch. The massive rear tires bit into the dirt. The tractor lurched forward, breaking through the freezing mud, dragging its immense weight toward the open barn doors. Hendricks stepped out of the way. He watched her drive the beast out into the freezing January wind, the black exhaust staining the gray sky. She drove it straight toward the property line, right to the edge where the Stantons' immaculate, sterile, computerized fields began. She parked it right on the boundary, and she left it idling, a loud, smoking, defiant middle finger made of scrap iron. Hendricks stood in the doorway of the barn, shivering, his face covered in soot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers were stiff with the cold. He dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. "Yeah, Eddie," Hendricks yelled into the receiver, trying to be heard over the roar of the tractor outside. "It's Hendricks. Listen, you still got that wrecked Peterbilt behind your shop, the one with the good front axle." "Yeah, don't scrap it. I'm coming to get it." He hung up. He looked out at Joanne, who was standing beside her smoking machine in the freezing wind, watching the Stanton farmhouse in the distance. Hendricks pulled his collar up. It was going to be a long winter. Frost coated the inside of Hendricks's windshield like a layer of ground glass. He scraped it away with a plastic cassette tape case, his breath pluming in the dark cab of his truck. In the bed, strapped down with heavy chains, was the front axle of a wrecked Peterbilt. It weighed 800 pounds, a solid beam of forged American steel coated in road grime and rust. He backed up to Joanne's barn just as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, casting long, pale streaks across the frozen mud. The heavy wooden doors were already open. Inside, the halogen work lights threw harsh, sharp shadows. Joanne was exactly where he left her yesterday. She was kneeling beside the skeletal remains of an international harvester, hacking at a bent tie rod with a battery-powered angle grinder. Sparks rained over her heavy canvas overalls. Hendricks killed his engine and stepped out. The cold bit into his bad knee immediately, a sharp ache that radiated up his thigh. He walked into the barn, the smell of ozone and burning abrasive discs thick in the air. "Got the axle," he said. She let off the grinder trigger. The whine spun down into silence, leaving a ringing in Hendricks's ears. Joanne flipped her safety glasses up. Her face was gray with metallic dust, the skin around her eyes deeply lined with exhaustion. "Back it in," she rasped. Her voice sounded like she had swallowed gravel. "We need to fabricate mounting brackets before the sun thaws the yard. Once this ground turns to soup, we won't be able to roll the engine hoist." They didn't talk much after that. There was no room for conversation, only the brutal, unforgiving geometry of heavy metal. They worked in a rhythm born of mutual necessity and shared stubbornness. Hendricks dragged the heavy steel plates to the drill press. He measured the bolt patterns with a greasy tape, measure his knuckles numb, accidentally slicing his thumb on a sharp metal burr. He didn't flinch. He just wrapped it in black electrical tape and kept drilling. The smell of cheap cutting oil smoking on the hot drill bit filled his nose, a sharp sulfurous scent. By noon, they had the Peterbilt axle suspended from the A-frame gantry hoist, dangling over the stripped chassis of the harvester. It looked absurd. The truck axle was too wide, the hubs protruding a foot past the tractor's frame rails. "Turning radius is going to be a mile wide," Hendricks noted, wiping a streak of black grease across his forehead with the back of his wrist. "It doesn't need to parallel park Hendricks," she muttered, sliding underneath with a welding helmet. "It just needs to hold up 2 tons of cast iron and drag a ripper through clay. Hand me the ground clamp." He tossed the heavy brass clamp. It hit the dirt beside her head with a dull thud. She clamped it to the frame and struck an arc. The harsh, brilliant blue light strobed against the barn walls. Hendricks looked away, rubbing his eyes. A shadow blocked the light from the doorway. Hendricks turned. Sheriff Wade stood there, his hands resting easily on his duty belt. He wore a heavy wool uniform jacket, his boots impeccably clean against the filthy backdrop of Joanne's floor. Wade was a decent man, but he was a man who answered to the county commissioners, and the commissioners answered to the Stantons. "Turn it off, Joanne," Wade called out. The welding stopped. Joanne slid out, pushing the helmet back. She didn't stand up. She just sat there on her piece of greasy cardboard, staring at the sheriff. "You're trespassing, Wade," she said flatly. "I'm delivering a notice," Wade replied, stepping gingerly over a puddle of drained transmission fluid. He pulled a folded piece of yellow paper from his breast pocket. 30 days are up next Tuesday. The zoning board rejected your appeal. They're moving to condemn the property and initiate a forced cleanup. Hendricks stepped forward. "Since when does a messy barn constitute condemnation? Half the farms in Mercer County have a bone pile in the back pasture." Wade looked at Hendricks, a flicker of genuine pity in his eyes. "Since Wilson Stanton brought in an environmental consultant from the city. They tested the runoff ditch at the property line, found elevated levels of diesel and hydraulic oil. They classified it as a hazardous material site, Hendricks. Fines are compounding at $500 a day. She owes $12,000 just to clear the ledger, plus the cleanup costs." Joanne stood up slowly. Her joints popped loud enough for Hendricks to hear. She wiped her hands on a rag, the fabric doing nothing to remove the deeply embedded grime. "They planted that oil," she said. Her voice lacked anger. It was terrifyingly calm. "I drain every pan into sealed drums. I don't spill." "Doesn't matter what you know," Wade said, softly, extending the yellow paper. "Matters what the lab report says. I'm sorry, Joanne. Tuesday. If that fine isn't paid, county deputies are coming to lock the gate." Joanne didn't take the paper. She just turned around and picked up her grinder. "Leave it on the anvil," she said, pulling her safety glasses down. The grinder screamed to life, drowning out whatever Wade was going to say next. The sheriff looked at Hendricks, shook his head, dropped the paper on a rusted anvil near the door, and walked out. Hendricks stared at the yellow sheet. $12,000. He looked at Joanne, hunched over the axle sparks, cascading over her shoulders. She was a ghost, building machines out of corpses. He reached into his pocket, feeling the worn leather of his wallet. He had maybe $3,000 in savings. It wasn't enough. "We need to get the front end welded before dark," Joanne yelled over the noise of the grinder. Hendricks didn't argue. He picked up a sledgehammer and went back to work. Late February broke the freeze, replacing the ice with deep, treacherous mud. The air smelled of rotting vegetation and thawing manure. It was planting season preparation, the most critical window in a farmer's year. Old Man Gilbert was standing in the middle of a 200-acre field of heavy clay, staring at a $500,000 piece of modern engineering. His brand-new lime-green machinery sat dead in the mud. The massive digital display inside the climate-controlled cab was flashing a single red error code, ERR-DEF-704 sensor fault. Limp mode engaged. Contact dealer. Hendricks's truck idled on the gravel-shoulder Joanne in the passenger seat. Behind them, on a heavy flatbed trailer, sat number 1, the Frankenstein tractor. It looked worse in the daylight. The mismatched paint, deer green Ford blue case red, looked like a bruised eye. But it wasn't leaking, and it was strapped down tight. Gilbert walked over to Hendricks's window, his boots sinking 2 inches into the muck with every step. He was a man accustomed to order his overalls clean, his cap uncreased. Right now, he looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "Dealer says they can't get a technician out here for 8 days, Gilbert said, his voice tight with panic. "The part is back-ordered from Germany. It's a $70 emission sensor on the exhaust pipe. Because it failed, the computer throttled the engine down to idle. I can't even pull it out of the field, let alone pull a 20-foot ripper." He looked past Hendricks to the flatbed. He swallowed hard. "Is that it?" "That's it," Joanne said, leaning across the cab. "Mechanical injection. No emission sensors. No computer. It runs on diesel kerosene, or whatever else you can pour down its throat. 200 horsepower at the PTO. "It looks like it's going to rattle itself to pieces," Gilbert muttered. "It might," Joanne replied, honestly. "But right now, my ugly iron can pull your ripper, and your shiny computer is a $500,000 paperweight. $2,000 for the week. Cash." Gilbert bristled. $2,000, that's extortion." "That's market rate for desperation," Hendricks interjected, his voice low and gravelly. "Rain is coming Thursday, Gilbert. You don't break this clay today, you're delayed 3 weeks. Your yields will drop by 20%. $2,000 is a bargain." Gilbert swore a long, bitter string of profanities directed at the sky, the dealership, and the mud. He reached into his chest pocket, pulled out a thick money clip, and peeled off $200 bills. He shoved them through the window. Joanne took the cash, her dirty, calloused fingers closing over the crisp paper. Hendricks dropped the trailer ramps. Joanne climbed up and hopped into the bare metal seat of number 1. She hit the starter. The massive John Deere block roared to life. A thick plume of black smoke rocketed from the straight pipe, drifting across Gilbert's pristine field. The mechanical clatter was deafening. Gilbert visibly winced, covering his ears. Joanne slammed the heavy transmission into gear. The tractor violently lurched down the ramps, the aggressive rear tires throwing chunks of gravel into the air. She drove it straight into the mud, pulling up alongside Gilbert's dead machine. They hooked the heavy tow chains to the 20-foot deep ripper, a massive implement designed to tear deep into the compacted soil. Gilbert watched with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. Joanne gave Hendricks a thumbs up. She throttled up. The engine howled a deep guttural roar that rattled the windows in Hendricks's truck. She popped the clutch. The tractor shuddered. The massive rear tires spun for a second, slicking the mud, and then they bit down to the hardpack below. The Frankenstein groaned. The custom-welded steel plates holding the transmission to the engine flexed. Suddenly, a loud pop echoed over the engine roar. A spray of hot amber fluid shot across the side of the engine block. Joanne killed the engine immediately. Silence slammed back into the field. Gilbert threw his hands up. "I knew it, junk, absolute junk." Hendricks was already out of the truck, moving as fast as his bad knee would allow. He reached the tractor just as Joanne hopped down. She was holding her left forearm, her jaw clenched tight. A high-pressure hydraulic line to the rear remotes had blown a fitting. Hot fluid was dripping from her sleeve. "You burned?" Hendricks asked, reaching for her arm. She pulled away, grabbing a rag from her back pocket and wiping the scalding oil off her skin. The flesh beneath was already turning an angry, blistered red. "I'm fine." The crimp on the fitting gave out. "I want my money back," Gilbert yelled, stomping over. "Get this heap of scrap off my land." Joanne ignored him. She looked at Hendricks. "Toolbox, side compartment. Get me the self-fusing silicone tape and 2 heavy-duty hose clamps. And a hacksaw." Hendricks didn't question her. He ran to the truck. When he returned, Joanne was already underneath the tractor, lying in the freezing wet clay. She was sawing the blown crimp, fitting off the end of the thick rubber hose. Hydraulic fluid dripped directly onto her face and chest. She didn't blink. She took the tape from Hendricks. Working blind, her burned arm trembling slightly, she wrapped the raw end of the hose, creating a thick, makeshift gasket. She shoved the hose back onto the steel nipple of the hydraulic pump and cranked the 2 hose clamps down with a socket wrench until the rubber bulged. "It's a patch," Hendricks warned, kneeling in the mud beside her. "Under pressure, it'll hold for maybe an hour. It has to hold for 10, she said, sliding out. She looked at Gilbert, her face smeared with mud and oil, her eyes burning with a fierce, unstable energy. "Hook the implement back up." Gilbert hesitated, intimidated by the sheer, unhinged determination radiating from her. He hooked the pins. Joanne climbed back into the seat. She didn't hesitate. She hit the starter, shoved it into a low gear, and dropped the hammer. The tractor roared. Black smoke poured out. The patched hose swelled, expanding dangerously under the pressure, but the clamps held. Number 1 strained the mismatched frame, twisting slightly, and then slowly, brutally, it moved. The deep ripper sank its massive steel shanks into the earth. The clay resisted, but the sheer brute torque of the unthrottled John Deere engine tore it open. The tractor dragged the massive implement forward, churning the earth, leaving a wide, dark scar of freshly turned soil in its wake. Hendricks stood beside Gilbert. They watched the ugly, smoking, deafening machine crawl across the field. It wasn't elegant. It was a street fight between iron and dirt. Gilbert pulled his cap off and wiped his sweating forehead. "I'll be damned," he whispered. Hendricks reached into his pocket and touched his lighter. "Yeah," he said softly. "She's something else." Word traveled fast in Mercer County. By Sunday, 3 more farmers had visited the Henderson place. They didn't come to the front door. They parked their trucks down by the gate and walked up to the barn, their boots crunching on the gravel, looking over their shoulders like they were buying contraband. Which, in a way, they were. They all had the same story. Tractors held hostage by software. Dealerships demanding thousands for basic resets. Crops waiting in the fields. Joanne took their names in her greasy leather binder. She didn't promise them anything, but she took their deposits. Grubby stacks of 20s, 50s, and hundreds. It was Monday night. The deadline for the county fine was Tuesday morning. Hendricks sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket inside the barn, staring at a pile of cash spread out on a makeshift workbench. $9,400. He looked across the barn. Number 2 was coming together faster than number 1. Hendricks had stopped pretending he was just helping out. He hadn't checked his own fences in 5 days. His hands were permanently stained black, the skin around his cuticles cracked and bleeding. He was exhausted, his body aching with a deep, bone-weary fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. But his mind was quiet. The grief that usually waited for him in his empty house was drowned out by the scream of the grinder and the heavy rhythm of the work. Joanne was tightening the lug nuts on a massive rear tire, using a 5-foot steel pipe as a cheater bar. She threw her entire body weight onto the bar, hanging off it until the bolt shrieked into submission. "We're short," Hendricks said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Even with Gilbert's money and the deposits, we're $2,600 short of the fine, and that doesn't cover the environmental cleanup fee they tacked on." Joanne let go of the pipe. It clattered against the concrete floor she had poured last week. She walked over to the bench, picking up a $50 bill. It was stained with a thumbprint of black grease. "I'm not paying the cleanup fee," she said. "I'll pay the fine, the 12 grand. That buys us time." "Joanne, they aren't going to take partial payment." Hendricks rubbed his face. His beard felt like wire against his calloused palms. "Wilson Stanton is on the zoning board. He wants this land. He wants to crush you." "Let's go to town," she said abruptly. Hendricks frowned. "What? Put the money in a bag. We're going to the diner. Wilson eats there every Monday night at 8. Prime rib special." She didn't wait for an answer. She stripped off her heavy canvas overalls, revealing a faded flannel shirt underneath, grabbed her keys, and walked out to her dually. Hendricks swept the cash into a heavy canvas bank bag and followed her. The lights of the Mercer County diner cut through the crisp evening air. Inside, it smelled of stale fry grease, spilled coffee, and bleach. The place was half full. As soon as Joanne and Hendricks walked in, the low murmur of conversation died out. Joanne looked awful. She hadn't showered in days. Her hair was matted under her cap, her burned arm wrapped in a dirty gauze bandage, her jeans stiff with dried oil. Hendricks didn't look much better. They looked like refugees from an industrial war. Wilson Stanton sat in the back booth. He wore a crisp, ironed, button-down shirt, a silver watch gleaming on his wrist. A plate of half-eaten prime rib sat in front of him. He looked up, his jaw pausing mid-chew as Joanne walked directly toward him. She didn't stop at the edge of the table. She slid into the booth opposite him. Hendricks stood awkwardly in the aisle, arms crossed, feeling the eyes of every farmer and waitress in the room boring into his back. Stanton swallowed. He wiped his mouth with a paper napkin. "You're ruining my dinner, Joanne, and you smell like a refinery." "I have your fine," she said. Her voice carried across the quiet diner. Stanton smiled, a thin, patronizing expression. "It's not my fine. It's the county's fine. You pay it at the courthouse tomorrow morning, if you have it, which I highly doubt." Joanne unzipped the canvas bag. She reached in and pulled out a handful of bills. They weren't neat. They were crumpled, stained, and smelled strongly of diesel and sweat. She dropped them directly onto Stanton's plate, right on top of his prime rib. Stanton recoiled, his chair squeaking against the linoleum. "What the hell are you doing?" She pulled out another handful, tossed it onto his mashed potatoes. "That's $9,400, Joanne said, her pale blue eyes locked onto his face. "Collected from your neighbors, the ones you and your dealership buddies are trying to bankrupt with diagnostic codes and forced obsolescence." Stanton's face flushed a deep, angry red. "You're crazy. Get this garbage off my food." "We're short," Joanne continued, ignoring him completely. "We owe 12, plus cleanup." She reached into her heavy jacket. For a terrifying second, Hendricks thought she was pulling a weapon. Instead, she pulled out a heavy, gleaming piece of metal. She slammed it down on the table. The heavy diner mug shattered, spilling coffee across the formica. Stanton jumped back. The diners gasped. It was a solid gold pocket watch, heavy, intricately engraved, heavily tarnished. "My husband's grandfather brought that over from Germany," Joanne said, her voice dropping to a low, ragged whisper. The bravado was gone, replaced by a raw, bleeding wound of a memory. "It's 18 karat, heavy casing, appraised at $4,000 scrap weight." She pushed it across the spilled coffee toward Stanton. "Take it to the board tomorrow. Tell them the fine is paid. Tell them the cleanup is funded." Stanton stared at the watch, then at the pile of greasy cash soaking up his gravy. His arrogant composure was cracking. He looked around the diner. Gilbert was sitting 2 booths down, watching intently. Several other farmers' men who owed Stanton money, men who bought seed from him, were staring, their expressions hardening. They saw the money. They saw the ruined woman giving up her last piece of heritage just to keep turning wrenches. "You can't pay fines at a diner," Stanton hissed, keeping his voice low. "This is a stunt." "It's a down payment on a war," Joanne said. She slid out of the booth. She didn't look back at the watch or the money. She walked past Hendricks, heading for the door. Hendricks looked at Stanton. The wealthy farmer looked small, sitting behind a barricade of dirty cash and a dead man's watch. "You poke a wounded dog, Wilson," Hendricks rumbled, adjusting his cap. "You better make sure you kill it, because she ain't dead." Hendricks turned and followed her out into the cold night. The door chimed cheerfully behind them. The silence in the diner lasted a long time after they were gone. May brought a humid, suffocating heat that settled over Mercer County like a wet wool blanket. The deep ruts in Joanne's yard had baked into jagged concrete ridges, snapping a tie rod on Hendricks's truck the week before. They didn't have time to fix it. Every waking hour was consumed by the iron. They had 4 machines running now. Number 2 was a terrifying amalgamation of an old Alice Chalmers cab and a heavy-duty Cummins diesel ripped from an overturned dump truck. Number 3 and 4 were equally grotesque, vibrating masses of naked wiring custom-welded steel plate and deafening mechanical exhaust. But they worked. Every morning at 4:30, headlights would sweep across the dirt yard. Farmers' men who had previously sneered at the bone pile arrived with heavy flatbeds. They handed over thick wads of cash strapped down the leaking, smoking beasts and hauled them away to break soil that their computerized $500,000 dealership tractors couldn't touch. The money went directly into a rusty Folgers coffee can on the workbench. It rarely stayed there longer than a day before being spent on salvage steel, welding wire, and bulk oil. Hendricks had moved a cot into the back corner of the barn. His own farm sat quiet and empty, a mile away, the silence there too heavy to bear. He woke up Tuesday night to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the familiar ping of contracting metal or the rustle of mice in the empty grain bins. It was a wet, heavy gurgle, a fluid sound. Hendricks sat up, his bad knee throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. He didn't turn on his flashlight. He grabbed the heavy steel breaker bar he kept by his cot and slipped out the side door into the thick, muggy darkness. The yard smelled strongly of raw diesel and something sweeter, sugar. He moved silently around the side of number 3, which had been returned that afternoon for a clutch adjustment. A shadow detached itself from the massive 200-gallon bulk fuel tank Joanne had bought at a farm auction. Hendricks lunged. He swung the breaker bar low, aiming for the legs. The heavy steel connected with a sickening thwack against a shin bone. A man cried out in the dark, stumbling backward into the gravel. A 5-gallon plastic bucket clattered to the ground, spilling a thick, gritty slurry over Hendricks's boots. "Stay down!" Hendricks growled, raising the bar. The figure didn't stay down. Scrambling frantically, the man threw a handful of sharp gravel into Hendricks's face. Hendricks cursed, throwing his arm up to protect his eyes. By the time he blinked the dust away, the shadow was limping fast toward the tree line, disappearing into the dense, overgrown brush bordering the Stanton property. Hendricks didn't chase him. His chest heaved as he walked over to the bulk tank. He clicked on his flashlight. The heavy brass padlock on the fill cap had been cleanly sheared off with bolt cutters. The bucket on the ground was coated in a thick paste of dissolved granulated sugar and water. Joanne appeared in the barn doorway, a silhouette against the harsh halogen work lights. She held her heavy angle grinder in one hand, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. "What happened?" Her voice was a raspy bark. Hendricks shined the beam on the severed padlock, then down at the sticky puddle soaking into the dirt. "Someone just tried to kill the fleet, tried to dump syrup into the main reserve. If this got into the fuel pumps, it would have seized every injector in all 4 blocks, ruined them permanently." Joanne walked over. She didn't look toward the tree line. She looked at the fuel tank. Her face, bathed in the sharp, narrow beam of Hendricks's flashlight, was a map of absolute exhaustion. The burn on her left arm, poorly bandaged for weeks, was visibly swollen beneath her flannel sleeve. "Did they get any in?" she asked. Her voice didn't shake. It was dead flat. Hendricks climbed the small metal ladder on the side of the tank. He unscrewed the cap and shined the light down. He sniffed the heavy fumes. "Smells clean. I think I caught him right as he popped the cap. But we can't trust it. We have to drain and filter 200 gallons before dawn, or Carver and O'Donnell can't take their leases out tomorrow." Joanne dropped the grinder. It hit the dirt with a heavy thud. She leaned against the rusted flank of number 3, her breathing shallow and ragged. "I don't have the filters," she whispered. It was the first time Hendricks had ever heard her admit defeat. She slowly slid down the massive rear tire until she was sitting in the dirt. She pulled her knees to her chest, her greasy hands trembling uncontrollably. "I'm out of money, Hendricks," she said to the dark yard. "The coffee can is empty. The deposits went to the hydraulic cylinders on number 4. Stanton knows it. That's why he sent someone tonight. He knows one cracked block, one ruined pump, and I default on the leases. The farmers get their money back, and I lose the land." She rested her forehead against her knees. She was burning with fever, her body finally surrendering to the infection, the lack of sleep, the sheer crushing weight of the iron. Hendricks stood there, feeling the heavy, humid wind pull at his jacket. He looked at the woman in the dirt, then at the massive, ugly machines sitting like gargoyles in the yard. He had spent his whole life watching things die. His wife, his farm, his town. He was tired of it. "Get up," Hendricks said. Joanne didn't move. Hendricks stepped forward, grabbing her by the collar of her jacket, and hauled her to her feet. She gasped in pain as her burned arm was jarred, but Hendricks didn't let go. He shoved her roughly toward the barn. "Get inside. Wash that arm with iodine. Sit in the chair. Do not come back out here." She stared at him, her pale eyes wide with a mixture of shock and feverish delirium. "Hendricks, the fuel, I'll handle the fuel." Hendricks snarled, his voice a deep, violent rumble in his chest. "You fix yourself. I'm not letting you die in a scrap yard." Morning broke like a bruised peach over the eastern ridge. The sky was an angry, hazy purple, thick with humidity. Joanne sat in the ripped bucket seat of an old Dodge van they used for parts storage. Her left forearm was wrapped tightly in clean white gauze that smelled sharply of medical iodine and rubbing alcohol. Her fever had broken sometime around 4 a.m., leaving her hollowed out, her clothes soaked in cold sweat. She stared out the open sliding door at the yard. Hendricks hadn't drained the tank. He couldn't. He didn't have the equipment. Instead, he had taken his truck, driving on a cracked tie rod that threatened to send him into a ditch with every pothole, and he had gone knocking on doors. Now the yard was full, not with county officials or deputies, with trucks. Ram 2500S Ford F350S beat-up Chevy Silverados. There were 12 of them parked in a jagged semicircle around the barn, their diesel engines idling, filling the humid morning air with a thick mechanical purr. Carver was there, a massive bearded man in heavily stained overalls. O'Donnell, a third-generation soybean farmer who was currently fighting for closure, was standing on the bed of his truck. Old man Gilbert was there, leaning against his pristine bumper, holding a heavy pump-action shotgun resting casually over his forearm. In the bed of every truck was a square white agricultural transfer tank, full of clean off-road diesel. Hendricks was standing in the center of the yard directing traffic. He looked over and saw Joanne sitting in the van. He walked over his boots, crunching loud in the silence left between the idling engines. "Carver brought 100 gallons, Hendricks said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag. "O'Donnell brought 50. Gilbert brought 200. They're pumping it directly into the tractors right now." Joanne swallowed. Her throat was painfully dry. "I can't pay them for that fuel, Hendricks. The can is empty." "They don't want your money?" Gilbert's voice boomed. He had walked up behind Hendricks, his shotgun gleaming dully in the morning light. Gilbert looked at Joanne, his face hard, weather-beaten, and thoroughly devoid of pity. "This wasn't charity. Stanton called my bank yesterday," Gilbert said, spitting a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt. "Tried to buy my loan out from under me. He knows I canceled my combine lease with his dealership. He knows I'm renting your scrap." Gilbert racked the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack echoing sharply across the yard. He popped the unspent shell into the air, caught it, and shoved it back into the tube. Wilson Stanton thinks he holds the keys to every ignition in this county, Gilbert said softly. But he can't hack a mechanical pump. He can't shut off a machine remotely if it doesn't have a screen. We ain't paying for your fuel, Joanne. We're paying for our independence. Carver walked over, dropping a massive heavy-duty padlock and a thick length of logging chain onto the hood of the van. Put that on the main tank. I've got 2 hired hands who are going to sleep in their trucks at the edge of your property line tonight. If anyone from Stanton's camp tries to cross the ditch, they'll be met with a spotlight and a tire iron. Joanne looked at the faces surrounding her. These were hard, cynical men. They had watched their neighbors go under and done nothing because in modern farming, survival often meant cannibalizing the weak. But Wilson Stanton had pushed too far. He had made the mistake of trying to starve them all at once. She slowly stood up. Her legs were shaky, but the fever fog had lifted, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. She looked at number 4. It was fueled up black smoke, already chugging lazily from the exhaust pipe, the heavy iron vibrating with pure, unadulterated power. She didn't thank them. They would have hated her for it. Instead, she walked over to the workbench, picked up her heavy leather binder, and flipped it open. Carver, she barked, her voice still rough, but carrying the sharp authority of a foreman. Number 3 needs the hydraulic remotes bled before you take it. O'Donnell, number 4 is yours, but the clutch is sticky. Don't ride it in second gear, or you'll glaze the plate, and I'll charge you for a replacement. Gilbert, you wanted a 50-foot rig puller. I need 3 days and a donor axle. You bring me the axle, I'll build the machine. The men nodded. They didn't smile. They turned and walked to the machines. Hendricks watched them climb into the rusted, mismatched metal seats. He listened to the brutal, deafening roar of 3 mechanical diesels revving up simultaneously. The sound hit him in the chest, vibrating against his ribs. It didn't sound like scrap anymore. It sounded like an army. He looked at Joanne. She had already picked up her angle grinder. "You're an idiot," Hendricks muttered affectionately, picking up his breaker bar. "I'm a mechanic," she replied, pulling her safety glasses down. "Hand me the 3/4 socket." 2 years later, the smell of pulverized copper and dust still hung in the air over Mercer County, but the landscape had fundamentally changed. The Henderson yard didn't look like a multi-million-dollar enterprise. It looked like a brutalist industrial complex dropped into the middle of rural farmland. Joanne had purchased the 80 acres adjacent to her original lot, buying it at a county auction, outbidding Wilson Stanton by a margin of $50,000, paid entirely in certified cashier's checks. The original barn was gone, replaced by a massive corrugated steel warehouse. Inside, overhead, gantry cranes moved continuously, groaning under the weight of massive engine blocks. The dirt floor had been poured over with 6 inches of reinforced concrete, permanently stained with a tapestry of oil, hydraulic fluid, and grease. 34 tractors were currently out on lease. They spanned across 3 states. Hendricks stood by the open bay doors holding a clipboard. His right knee was worse now. He walked with a heavy, pronounced limp, relying on a custom-welded steel cane he had fabricated himself. He wore a clean Carhartt jacket, though his hands remained permanently etched with black grease in the deep creases of his skin. He checked off a line on the clipboard as a massive flatbed semi backed into the loading zone. Strapped to the trailer was number 22. It was an absolute monster, a custom-built articulated tractor, utilizing 2 separate transmission housings and an industrial logging engine. It looked like a tank missing its turret. The driver hopped out, handing Hendricks a thick envelope. Monthly lease payment from the Reese Cooperative in Ohio, the driver shouted over the noise of the shop. They said it pulled a 40-foot cedar through mud that swallowed their shiny new John Deere whole. Hendricks took the envelope, feeling the satisfying thickness of the cash inside. Tell Reese it's due for an oil change. If he skips the filter, Joanne will void his contract and repossess it. The driver laughed, shook his head, and climbed back into his cab. Hendricks turned and walked toward the back office. It wasn't really an office. It was a retro-fitted shipping container bolted to the side of the warehouse, vibrating intensely with the noise from the shop floor. He pushed the heavy metal door open. The air conditioning inside was fighting a losing battle against the heat radiating from the shop. Joanne sat behind a massive steel desk she had welded herself from scrap I-beams. She hadn't changed much. The gray in her hair had completely taken over, pulled back into a tight, practical knot. She still wore heavy denim, but her eyes weren't hollow anymore. They were sharp-focused and utterly unapologetic. On the wall behind her was a massive whiteboard covered in grease pencil markings, lease schedules, parts inventory, and a long waiting list of farmers desperate for machines that wouldn't lock them out. Beside the whiteboard, framed in heavy scratched plexiglass, was a tarnished gold pocket watch. Stanton had left it at the county clerk's office when he paid the fine 2 years ago. Joanne had retrieved it. It was permanently stopped at 3:15. Ohio payment, Hendricks said, tossing the envelope onto the desk. Joanne didn't look up from the ledger she was annotating. Put it in the safe. I need to order 6 more remanufactured injection pumps from that supplier in Texas. And we need to hire another welder. Eddie is pulling double shifts, and his beads on the custom frames are getting sloppy. I'll call the Union Hall in the city, Hendricks said, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked out the reinforced window of the container. Across the road a mile away sat the Stanton Agricultural Dealership. The massive glass showroom gleamed in the afternoon sun. Out front, neatly arranged on pristine gravel, sat 20 brand new lime green and bright red tractors. They were beautiful. They had GPS-guided steering climate-controlled cabs and millions of lines of proprietary code running through their internal networks. They hadn't moved in 6 months. Weeds were beginning to grow up through the pristine gravel, wrapping around the massive tires of the unsold inventory. Farmers were driving past the gleaming showroom to pull their flatbeds into Joanne's oily, deafening yard. Stanton laid off 3 of his sales guys yesterday. Hendricks mentioned casually watching the empty dealership lot. Joanne finally stopped writing. She set her pen down and leaned back in her heavy chair. The chair shrieked in protest. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a battered pack of cigarettes. She lit one, taking a deep drag, not bothering to offer one to Hendricks. He had quit a year ago after a mild heart attack right there on the shop floor. She exhaled a long plume of smoke toward the ceiling vent. Wilson Stanton sells software disguised as iron, she said softly, her voice still carrying that ruined gravelly edge. He thought the dirt cared about Bluetooth. The dirt only cares about horsepower and weight. She picked up a heavy grease-stained gear off her desk, turning it slowly in her hands. They thought they could kill us off because we were broken, she continued, looking directly at Hendricks. They didn't realize that when you break something down to its base components, you can build it back into whatever you need it to be. Hendricks smiled. It was a rare expression on his weathered face, tight and knowing. He tapped his steel cane against the metal floor. You built $1 million empire out of corpses, Joanne. I built a junkyard, she corrected him, crushing the cigarette out in a heavy brass ashtray. It just turns out the whole world is desperate for junk. She stood up, grabbed her heavily stained work coat off the back of the chair, and shoved her arms into the sleeves. "Break time's over, old man," she said, walking past him toward the shop door. "Number 27 needs its main seal replaced before 6 o'clock, and you're the only one small enough to reach the top bell housing bolts without pulling the entire cab." Hendricks groaned, his knee throbbing in preemptive sympathy. "I'm 72 years old, Joanne. I shouldn't be climbing on top of transmissions." "Then don't slip," she called back over her shoulder, already disappearing into the blinding sparks and deafening roar of the grinding wheels. Hendricks stood alone in the office for a second. He looked at the framed gold watch. He looked at the thick envelope of cash on the desk. Then he listened to the brutal, chaotic, beautiful scream of heavy iron coming from the shop floor. It smelled like burned diesel, hot steel, and survival. Hendricks adjusted his grip on his cane, pulled his faded cap down tight over his eyes, and walked out into the noise to get his hands dirty.